Our first speaker is Mark Beliles, who is, I would say, the Henry Kissinger of the religious field. He has been to about 40 countries, I believe, and traveling around lecturing. He was a pastor for some 40 years and has a very beautiful wife here, Nancy, and he is our first speaker. He's the author and co-author of several scholarly books, including Doubting Thomas, The Religious Life and Legacy of Thomas Jefferson, and the selected religious letters and papers of Thomas Jefferson. His PhD dissertation is Free as the Air, Churches and Politics in Jefferson's Virginia. Beliles founded the Providence Foundation in 1983 and has convened several scholarly symposiums about Jefferson and religion at the University of Virginia, co-sponsored by the Virginia Foundation of the Humanities. Residing in Charlottesville, he has served a dozen years as chairman of the Historic Resources Committee for the City of Charlottesville and co-chairman of the 250th anniversary held in 2012. Beliles has worked 36 years as a pastor. I gave him 40 years credit, but he says it's 36. He presently serves as president of the Global Transformation Network as a lecturer, writer, and leadership coach. And in this capacity, he has traveled and spoken in these many countries that I mentioned. I give you Mark Beliles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wallenborn and Mr. Dixon. It's an honor to be here and to be invited to be one of the different speakers, distinguished speakers here at this forum. It is indeed, being a person who also has lived in Charlottesville for so many years, I've been forced to become a student of this very important founding father here. And it's been a lifelong kind of pursuit in many ways for the last 30 years. Been studying Jefferson, in particular how he does relate to religion. So this morning I have a difficult task that I'm going to try to achieve, which is just to discuss Jefferson's religious image, his beliefs, without, and I know in bringing this up is something that's probably one of the most, I think one of the most passionate areas of Jefferson. People feel very strongly about what they think he believes, and so sometimes very academic discussions become difficult, but I hope to present information that will help to maybe at least cause us to pause, look at the Jefferson image in regards to religion in a new way. Indeed, as it was mentioned, I've primarily started years ago with my doctoral dissertation just studying the religious history of this community in the time period of Jefferson and Madison. And because of that, it led me into really more directly studying Jefferson's religious beliefs himself. And so finally, that particular research was finally just published in the last couple of years. The books, which are over here on the table, you can get. I was delighted to finally bring to publication so that people could really learn some of the things that I learned. In fact, one of the things that I discovered is that really there is a lot of information that people have never heard about when it comes to Jefferson and religion. You see, there's still about quite a few years that have yet to be published, and of Jefferson's letters. Most people there's many things dealing with religion no one has ever really seen before. And the result of my own research led me to the conclusion that truly the modern common image of Jefferson and religion is really a distortion of reality. So in the theme of this forum, The Man Behind the Myths, I hope to maybe pull back some of the myths and we can see some interesting insights. Jefferson is a person who was, I think, the image of him, when it comes to religion, was primarily shaped by the political campaign of 1800. Many of you are probably very aware of how during this campaign, some people began to attack Jefferson on his religious beliefs. Primarily, these were religious leaders from New England, New York, places that were more connected regionally to the Federalist Party, which was in this campaign was being challenged for the first time by the new emerging party represented by Jefferson. And so a number of religious leaders, clergymen, wrote pamphlets and essays and spoke out suggesting Jefferson was an infidel, a deist, a variety of other kinds of terms that they portrayed him, and it was something that was quite strong, and Jefferson clearly was affected by it. But one of the things I discovered, and I did a lot of research on this, I tried to find, were there any clergymen south of New York that had ever attacked Jefferson's religious beliefs? And I have searched high and low, and I found actually none. There was never in his entire lifetime a clergyman that questioned his own religious beliefs. There was, and I found this surprising. I didn't expect that, because especially in Virginia, Jefferson, of course, was known for his leading the effort to disestablish the Anglican Church in Virginia. And of course, there was many clergymen in opposition to that, of course, from the Anglican Church. But yet, I found none that actually attacked him personally, that in any aspect of questioning his personal beliefs at that time. It would only been maybe disagreement with his bills. But there was, and so anyway, I have found, and I'd be glad to very much welcome if someone finds something that I've overlooked, but I never found anyone south of New York that ever questioned Jefferson's religious beliefs. But after his death, some religious historians began to repeat some of those charges that were made by those opponents from New England, and these began to be repeated quite a bit in various religious histories, and as a result, there was gradually an image of Jefferson as more of a skeptic, as more of an orthodox kind of person when it comes to religion, began to emerge more frequently. And finally, to this day, this really has become now the image that is a little more of the common one that people hold of Jefferson, as a person who was not a traditional Christian, and people tend to not want to give him people try to come up with all kinds of other descriptive terms for him: theist, deist, rationalist. I mean, there's all kinds of things, and you won't find me in any of my books, and even here today, try to actually myself give him a descriptive name. I am going to, though, try to give to you just direct quotes and information and what he himself called himself, and I think that would perhaps be more helpful. Again, modern historians tend to perpetuate the distortion for several reasons. Again, there's still really 16 what I would call the underpublished years of Jefferson. The official papers of Thomas Jefferson at Princeton have about 16 years have yet to publish, and I particularly went into many of those years and to look into the direct letters that have yet to be printed anywhere, and found quite a few. In fact, I published in my book over 50 letters by Jefferson dealing with religion that have never been in print ever before. There is still a lot of information out there that we can discover. And also, it's one of the things I found in most all the biographies of Jefferson today is an imbalance of quotes. Quotes are usually drawn from the very last period of his life, when he certainly was more unorthodox in his religious beliefs. And these, though, become the predominant kinds of quotations you hear repeated over and over. And I've discovered also over 200 religious leaders and church groups, religious groups that Jefferson corresponded with, that he wrote letters to, that yet it's interesting to note that out of these 200, only about 15 of those would be themselves unorthodox in their beliefs, and yet those 15 out of the 200 are the quotations from those letters are the ones that dominate the biographies of Jefferson. This creates, this imbalance of sources, of quotations, creates not necessarily the quotes that are there are not inaccurate, but that yet it's a sense of context, of scale, of how much Jefferson was writing about the things in those few unorthodox letters versus so many other things he said in his life. There's also a general, I think modern historians have quite a great degree of ignorance about the local religious culture that shaped Jefferson, had an impact upon him. I'm going to bring out some of those things that are here in my talk. And also there's a great degree of reliance on what I would call some less reliable documents that Jefferson actually letters he never sent. They were the discarded drafts, and they become predominant in a lot of these things in religion. So the distorted legacy I will summarize in 4 basic ways, and the ways I've used these words you could differ with, but it fundamentally is 4 basic things that tend to come out in most of the biographies of Jefferson. One is that in general somehow he's an opponent or an enemy of traditional Christian religion, of clergy in particular, the antagonist with a lot of clergy in America, that he was maybe a lifelong skeptic, that he never really believed in the traditional doctrines of the church, of Christianity, that he was a person who rejected most of the Bible and didn't believe all of that, and this is associated with the so-called Jefferson Bible that you see in print many places, and that he had a generally secularistic approach to the relationship between religion and public life. And when I say that, meaning that the image is that he desired that religion not be have an influence in the public square, but that those things be completely secular in the way policies are developed. This idea of separation of church and state that perhaps people have of how they view his understanding of that. To kind of address some of these distortions of the real picture of his religious beliefs, I'm going to kind of take us through a chronological overview and just bring out a few of I have found about 1,100 letters and documents in Jefferson's life that touch on religion in some way. So I'm only going to have the time in the few minutes I have to present a few of them, but a few of them that I think perhaps might be new to many of us here, that are rarely brought out in a lot of the biographies out there. I came to through my research of these 1,100 documents, began to see what I would consider sort of like 5 phases of Jefferson's religious life that seem to emerge. Now, some of these may not be hard and fast. You can see tendencies in different phases of some of the same things, but yet some degree of what I would call sort of some shifts, some development of his beliefs over time. And so I'm going to take us through these 5 phases, starting with the first one, which would be the longest phase. This was his first 25 years of his adult life, from really when we see is the very first letters where we can see what he's thinking. In 1762, the first letters he starts writing is really as a man just having finished his undergraduate years at College of Women Mary and beginning his adult years. And so now we have an ability to start to see what he thought and believed. And to give a little sense of context, I wanted to just first off mention something that many people do not realize, but out here in the Central Virginia Piedmont, a religious revival that most people are very aware of is called the First Great Awakening, was actually very strong out here in this area. It came to this area a little later than it was up in New England and the eastern seaboard in the cities. It came to this frontier of Central Virginia about 10 years later, and it lasted longer in its impact. The Great Awakening, this revival, was something that was noted, and you could see in the emergence of different new churches that were strong in this region, different denominations that even kind of settled this county of Albemarle simultaneously. It was not just an Anglican county, it was Presbyterians came over from the valley at the same time in the settlement of this county, and Baptists showed up soon after that. And it was a very diverse kind of religious environment here on the frontier at the time. And Jefferson knew many of these religious leaders of the Great Awakening in Virginia. Devereux Jarrett, the leading Anglican revivalist, he knew. And a Baptist man named John Leland here in the area, a Methodist man named Henry Fry, who actually originally was on the vestry of the Anglican Church here with Jefferson. And he became the Methodist revivalist leader. And one of the things that the Great Awakening did was spawned the formation of new independent churches. And that's probably one of the most important facts that I want to introduce this morning, that in this first phase of Jefferson's life, something that most people never hear about. I found only one, maybe two biographies that even mention it, but that Jefferson, just shortly after he wrote the Declaration of Independence, also wrote a document. In fact, it was the leading figure in helping to found a new independent church in Charlottesville. Just 6 months after the Declaration of Independence, he helped draft this founding document of what is called the Calvinistical Reformed Church that met in the courthouse. This probably might be just surprising to a lot of people, because later in life he made some very strong statements against Calvinism and Presbyterians, so you almost might think, wow, this almost seems impossible to believe. But it was true. This is something he did at this time that we see in his papers. And Jefferson was, again, the leading figure who was drafted the founding document of this church and put his name first on the list and pledged the most money for the support of the pastor. I want to just read a little bit from this founding document that, from Jefferson's own words, he drafted this document, and this is what it says. We, the subscribers, desirous of encouraging and supporting the Calvinistical Reformed Church and of deriving to ourselves through the ministry of its teachers the benefits of gospel knowledge and religious improvement, do hereby oblige ourselves, our heirs, executors, and administrators to pay the sums that were listed at the bottom there, those amounts. In consideration whereof, we expect that the said Charles Clay shall perform divine service and preach a sermon in the town of Charlottesville on every fourth Sunday or oftener. And we further mutually agree with each other to take care of such books and vestments as shall be provided for the use of our church. Now, again, as I said, unfortunately, this is almost never found in most modern biographies of Jefferson. I think probably it's because of what I would say is the distorted religious image. This doesn't show up because it just doesn't fit the paradigm of many modern historians. They can't imagine this really something that had validity, and so they tend to just simply ignore it. But it's an actual document he drafted. This church began. We have evidence of it because of the sermons that Reverend Clay preached that survived to this day right in that courthouse. It lasted at least 6 or 7 years during the War for Independence. It dissolved after that, and because Reverend Clay moved away, Jefferson went to France, and some of the leading supporters were not there. And so this congregation did kind of slip into oblivion after that, and so often it's ignored. But yet it was the church that Jefferson chose voluntarily after independence from England, when no longer by law you were required to identify as an Anglican and support the Anglican Church through the taxes. This was the first church that we have where Jefferson, completely of his own free will, chose to associate with and support and with his finances. And this was a church that was something that is interesting as well because of the choice of the pastor. You see, Charles Clay had been the Anglican minister of the parish where Jefferson served. St. Anne's Parish Jefferson was on the vestry of that church, as well as the vestry of Fredericksville Parish before that. We have documentation that shows that. But here, so Jefferson knew this man, had come to know him quite well, Reverend Clay. Happened to be, by the way, a cousin of Henry Clay, the famous senator later from Kentucky. And he was, but Charles Clay was unusual by Anglican standards because, as Bishop Meade, the historian of the of the Episcopal Church in Virginia describes Reverend Clay was an uncommon evangelical Anglican. He was a man who himself was converted during the Great Awakening by a Presbyterian man, but decided to become an Anglican minister, but instead of getting his training from the College of William and Mary, was personally mentored by Devereux Jarrett, the leading Anglican revivalist during the Awakening. And so he becomes the minister of St. Anne's Parish, and then now the one who Jefferson voluntarily supports as being, as it says here, the leader of our church, as Jefferson writes. Now, in this, by the way, there's about 50 handwritten sermons by Reverend Clay that are today in the Virginia Historical Society. I've analyzed a lot of those sermons. In the back of my book, Downey Thomas, I've published 2 of those, first time any of these have ever been published, that again shows the kind of preaching that was in this church. It wasn't as formal as most Anglican kinds of churches. It was very Jonathan Edwards kind of preaching, more of a Great Awakening kind of sermons as you read these sermons. So it's quite astonishing in many ways that Jefferson would be funding and associating with this kind of preaching, this congregation. Another thing that I want to, so that was really the first phase where we see Jefferson. I just quickly want to mention, we can see in his own memorandum books, his account books, clearly ongoing support of this church. The next year in 78, he donates to support Reverend Clay, as he had committed to do. And you can see multiple other evidences in different years. By 1782 is when Reverend Clay moved away, and then we see Jefferson beginning to support Reverend Matthew Maury to be the preacher in the courthouse from 1782 onward. And so we have quite a bit of evidence of this kind of support and commitment. There are some documents in this first period that I should mention without much time to really explain them, but in my own study of Jefferson and religion, I've put some documents, what I would call, in a less reliable category for defining Jefferson. The reason they clearly are written by him, but yet, for instance, like his public documents while serving in the legislature of Virginia or in the Congress, often are done in collaboration in a committee form. And so to some extent, if he just was able to write and draft something completely on his own, perhaps they would be a little bit differently. They'd reflect him, but yet at the same time, I take them as a little less reliable to say, absolutely, this is what he'd done if he had been alone. But there's also some other documents that are more private. Two important sets of notes are from this early period, one called the Literary Commonplace Notes, and then the Notes on Religion. The Commonplace Notes had contained a number of very skeptical statements about God and the Bible and religion and Christianity, but the Notes on Religion in 1776 had very orthodox quotes that we find there. Unfortunately, we don't, again, Jefferson, just in copying different quotations, different writers on religion in these, does not necessarily give any comment as to if he agreed with these or not. So all we know is that he copied them. We don't really know if he agreed with them. And Douglas Wilson, the former chief historian at Monticello, in fact, who's the one who was the editor of the Commonplace Notes that were published by Princeton, makes this comment, says, we really have no way of knowing, did Jefferson agree with this or not? We just know that he copied these things. And that's why I put these two things in the less reliable category. It would be important to note, though, that the 1760s, those Commonplace Notes, would be the only document we have in this first 25 years of Jefferson's life that would have any evidence of him being in any way unorthodox or skeptical. But again, it was just quotes that were there of some people who expressed these views. And so it's something that, at least if we bring it up and included it as to help us to understand Jefferson's beliefs, we have to at least qualify that. And unfortunately, many historians, biographers do not. Often, in fact, I think it's quite unfortunate. They will quote from those first set of notes, the quotations that were unorthodox, and completely ignore the other orthodox quotes 10 years later, the notes on religion. This is not really a valid way of presenting Jefferson's religious beliefs, and creates and perpetuates a distortion. So basically, in this first 25 years, there's nothing that we could find that would in any way actually make us think definitively that Jefferson was anything less than an avid churchman, a person that had held to traditional Christian beliefs. In the second phase, though, which I have starting in 1788, we do see some beginnings of questioning of certain doctrines that begins to emerge. You might know of the Jefferson at the very end of the first period, in 1787, does emphasize reason when he writes to Peter Carr and urges him to consider religion completely on a rational basis. But Jefferson in no way in that letter directly says that he has rejected any of these things or disbelieves anything. But we do clearly see in 1788 in a letter to a neighbor, Mr. Dario, who had asked Jefferson to be a sponsor in baptism of one of his children, Jefferson replies to him and says that he had never sense enough to comprehend the Trinity, and as a result asked to be excused from doing this. In other words, he felt conscientiously at this point he could not guarantee he was going to teach that doctrine to this person that's basically a godparent is supposed to promise to do, and raise them up in those beliefs. So this is the first time where we see Jefferson says, I don't feel like I fully understand the Trinity, so I'm not going to make that commitment. Now, he doesn't actually say he rejects the Trinity, he just says he doesn't understand it. And this is the most we have still in this period to say that really does show, though, some questioning that had begun in Jefferson's life. He did begin to interact with Richard Price, a Unitarian in England, attended one of his services and asked for literature on the Trinity from Richard Price. So he certainly was beginning to study and think about these things from a new perspective. Yet at the same time, from the next 15 years, he still does, in no way, even this questioning, does it cause him to in any way withdraw from his active support and participation with the Episcopal Church and basically traditional churches in different places, both in Philadelphia, back at home in Virginia, and in the capital in Washington. We find him continue to support, donate to, attend worship services that were traditional in nature, not necessarily. He did, while in Philadelphia, attend some of the services of Joseph Priestley, more of a Unitarian man that was held in Philadelphia, at least several times. He did that. But he did not necessarily at all withdraw from traditional kinds of Orthodox churches. One of the things that we also see him continue to give, and I've just listed a few, there's so many, where he donated to different churches. Even when he went to Washington, he donated to Baptist and Methodist, and he gave support. He was worshiping with all these different kinds of congregations that mixed together and shared the Capitol building before there were any other buildings in Washington. Very much like the courthouse scenario that was in Charlottesville. They had to listen to each other's preachers of different denominations. This is very much the Jefferson kind of life, a much more interdenominational kind of man than most of the founding fathers. Another interesting thing, though, I wanted to point out is this letter to Samuel Smith in Baltimore. It tells us something quite interesting you probably never hear normally. He writes to this man in Baltimore about a Presbyterian preacher named John Glendy, who actually was from Stanton at the time. And he says, "This John Glendy, a Presbyterian clergyman, is the most eloquent preacher of the living clergy whom I have heard. In this he is really great, and I may safely say he is unrivaled. You will be commonly pleased with such an acquisition to your city." Somehow or another, he had heard Reverend Glendy preach different places. In fact, we have a letter from Meriwether Lewis, his secretary, one time telling Jefferson just about a year before this that Glendy was supposed to preach in the courthouse in Charlottesville, but fell sick, and Meriwether Lewis gives this information to Jefferson. So there are things that's quite interesting. Somehow Jefferson was being exposed to other kinds of Presbyterian preachers, services from different kinds of churches. One of the things that we also find in this, I'll just then summarize then. So that's the second phase of his life. Basically, the only real things that would show anything other than orthodox kinds of beliefs is that had started to question the Trinity and attended some other unorthodox services of Reverend Priestley in Philadelphia, but yet still also was connected to the traditional churches as well. When we start the third phase, which I mark as 1803, it's important to talk about something going on, again, in the local religious context that's also very important and often overlooked by most biographers. One is, this is now a new religious revival that was happening in the United States, known as the Second Great Awakening. It was more prominent out in the frontiers than in the more cities, this revival. Cane Ridge, Kentucky, there was very famous camp meetings that took place there. But what most people do not realize, that in Virginia, this revival was very strong as well, in particular in Albemarle County, in this areas right around the Central Virginia Piedmont. Camp meetings became quite phenomenal. There were more here in Albemarle than any place else in Virginia. In fact, one of these kind of open-air camp meetings was held right at the base of Monticello Mountain there at Milton. Actually, it was a bigger city than Charlottesville at that time in 1804. And there was about 4,000 people that gathered there at Milton to hear an evangelist named Lorenzo Dow. He's probably the most popular. He's like the Billy Graham of that founding father era. And so 4,000 people, we're talking about that's 10 times the population of Charlottesville. It's a huge event. And just in this one that we have record of. And yet, and it drew from all classes of society, from the enslaved communities, as well as even Jefferson's daughter came to it, and members of the Jefferson family. There were just different people from all aspects of life that attended these things. And again, Jefferson came to know many of the leaders of these camp meetings. Henry Fry, the Methodist, became the leading organizer of most of these camp meetings. Jefferson was a friend, and we have letters that Jefferson wrote to Fry that in correspondence between the two. And there was Jefferson visited in Fry's home at times and talked with him, as well as Jefferson knew some of these others that were there. Actually, interesting, Reverend Fry responded to a letter to Jefferson, and when the letter was delivered by hand to Jefferson in Washington, D.C., it was delivered by hand by Lorenzo Dow, that leading American evangelist, in person. So it was just an interesting kind of another aspect of Jefferson's connections that you very rarely hear about. But the thing that emerged from these sort of open-air camp meetings, which were very interdenominational, was a new kind of movement, a religious thought, and an emphasis that became known by historians as the Restoration Movement. The Restoration Movement was a movement that sought to bring unity among Christians by going back to the original, restoring original primitive Christianity. And the leading figures of this, one of the first ones was from Virginia, a man named James O'Kelly, but there were others in other parts of the country as well that were leaders of this. Jefferson, again, you don't know if Jefferson knew any of these directly. There's no evidence of that. But yet, some of the things that this movement was characterized by, we do see in Jefferson's life. For instance, like in their desire to bring unity among Christians, they said, we're going to call ourselves just Christians only, not Episcopalians or Methodists or Baptists, just Christians. They rejected creeds. They thought creeds and confessions were what divided Christians. So they said, anything that's not directly in the Bible, we're not going to require anybody to believe it. And so, and that, by the way, included the idea of the Trinity, because the word Trinity was not in the Bible. So many of these really the evangelical preachers in this movement threw out the Trinity themselves at this point, because they said it was not a word in the Bible. And they especially rejected Calvinism, blamed it. I'm talking about the clergy as one of the sources of division. And clericalism, the division between the clergy laity. They all themselves said the Bible had been corrupted and wanted to see it restored. Alexander Campbell, by the way, himself, just a few years after Jefferson wrote his Life and Morals of Jesus, his abridgment of the New Testament, Alexander Campbell did his own edition of the Bible, trying to restore it and deal with the corruptions that he thought were there previously. And they also emphasized building new meeting houses that they called union meeting houses, that allowed Christians to meet together without having to come under the umbrella maybe of a particular denomination. Now that's important because of what we see in Jefferson's life in this third phase. We see Jefferson beginning to express himself, like in this letter to Benjamin Rush, a Presbyterian man in Philadelphia, that he says, my beliefs are very different from that anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian. And he goes on and defines that. But the point is, you start seeing Jefferson say this, I'm a Christian. That's his way of identifying himself, like much of the Restoration movement. We also see things in that very same year, 1803, like in his account book, he makes a donation to a union meeting house in Charlottesville. Many of you don't realize this. This was the only place of worship, house of worship, for about 20 years in Charlottesville until the first denominational structure was erected in the year of Jefferson's death, in 1826. That's the Episcopal Church. For about 20 years, there was a union meeting house in downtown Charlottesville. It was actually on the site where the Episcopal Church is today. And that was, Jefferson donated to this in 1803. We see this in his account books. The same year, we also see him donating to one of these leaders in the local area of the Restoration Movement, a man named Thomas Cavender. And we also, Jefferson's clearly more knows of these kind of movements and is connected to it. And there's, I already mentioned Henry Fry. We see Jefferson, though, many other places. I've only put a few here where he supports churches other places. He gave money to build a church in Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase. And it would be incorrect, however, to think that, again, just because Jefferson is even more interdenominational in his kind of religious life, that he was withdrawing from the Episcopal Church. Very clearly, like in 1807, Jefferson, to the Episcopal minister in Washington, says this. He says, I take this occasion at testifying the pleasure and the satisfaction with which I have continued a member of your congregation from my first residence here, which was in 1800, till the removal of the church to its present distance. It just was opening its own church in Washington that year. This circumstance solely occasioning my discontinuance of attendance. Up until this time, Jefferson was attending. We have records he was donating to that Episcopal church in Washington, was an official member of it as a donation, and he was a man who was then having support up to now. At this point, he decides not to because it's further away to get to, and it basically doesn't have to go further away because it just so happens that Reverend McCormick was also congressional chaplain and was holding services in the Capitol anyway, which was closer. So he still had the same preaching and pastor, but he could go just hear it in the Capitol. So these are things that we see in this third period. He clearly also has evidence that probably many of you already know, you've seen in other places, where he writes letters to other people, Joseph Priestley, Unitarian, a man named Ralph Eddowes, a Universalist in Philadelphia, clearly saying he agrees with many of their views. So clearly there's a sense of agreement with, especially this idea of corruption of Christianity and this kind of thing. You also know, of course, his abridgment of the Gospels emerges at this time in 1804. He called it the philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, that was extracted from the account of his life and doctrines as given by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being the abridgment of the New Testament for the use of the Indians. unembarrassed with matters of fact or faith beyond the level of their comprehensions. There was actually different clergy missionaries who were writing to Jefferson at this time, that we can see this in the correspondence, after the Louisiana Purchase brought in thousands of new Indian tribes under the federal government's auspices, writing urging him to help get Bibles out and translated into the Indians. And instead of doing that, he puts together this little collection of just the words of Jesus, just his moral teachings. And there are others, but I would call this still a less reliable document. Unfortunately, it's cut off at the top, less reliable document, because he doesn't really explain, he never sends this to anybody, he never shows it to anyone, and we don't really have any explanation of particular passages why he chose one thing or another. All we know is he said it was to be the philosophy of Jesus, a compilation. The last phase, and I've got to hurry up, I'm running out of time, starting in 1813. Here is when clearly Jefferson, without a doubt, unambiguously rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and a couple other doctrines. We see for the first time in 1813 to John Adams, he rejects the Trinity as a corruption. He also writes to William Canby and says that he believes that just good morals will basically get you into heaven. This will be a contrast to the Christian doctrine of salvation by faith. And there's a different kinds of things he begins to say. Yet at the same time, and there's a lot more in this phase, this is where you hear most of the quotations of Jefferson, 1813 onward. A lot of unorthodox statements, a lot of rejection of traditional beliefs. But yet, at the same time, we still have him organizing church services for Presbyterians. Like in Charlottesville, here's a letter in 1815. He writes to John Glendy. Remember, he said he was his favorite preacher back in Washington. Now he says, I tried to attend you at Charlottesville, but the weather was a great disappointment, and the loss of the pleasure of hearing you is the more regretted, as it can rarely, if ever, be expected again. People don't realize, Glendy wrote to him and said, can you organize a meeting for me to preach in Charlottesville? And so Jefferson did, but unfortunately the weather kept people from going. Why don't we why don't we have this image of Jefferson organizing preaching for Presbyterians in the courthouse of Charlottesville? It just doesn't ever come up as something that's even valid when we think of Jefferson in most people's mind. But you see so much more complexity and diversity of beliefs in Jefferson's life at this time that at least I think should give us pause before we assume things that are just a simple analysis or statement of his beliefs. Let me go on. There are other letters that we could see here, but his last phase was the last 6 years of his life, 1820. And the reason I mention this as a new phase is because when finally an Episcopalian minister comes to town, there had not been one for most of the beginning years of Jefferson's retirement years, so there were no regular Episcopal services. But when Reverend Hatch comes to town to start having regular Episcopal services, Jefferson immediately, we see in his donations and his connections and other ways in letters, he begins to shift from being, as he said in 1819, a sect by myself, because basically there was no Episcopal church at all, to all of a sudden 1820, now he calls himself a member of the Episcopal Church. We see him when he writes here, in fact, he says, when our pastor builds a house, he writes to Reverend Hatch, each of his flocks should give him an aid. And he goes on and he responds to then a Presbyterian man who comes to start a Presbyterian church who asked Jefferson he wanted to join it. And he said, I've been from my infancy a member of the Episcopalian Church, and to that I owe and make my contributions. He becomes regularly connected to the Episcopal Church to the end of his life. There, once it had started, apparently they're participating in the Apostles' Creed was a regular thing. In fact, we have a letter where he talks in the Apostles' Creed, we all declare that we believe in the resurrection of the body. Things that seem to show him a little bit coming a little more back with the Episcopal style of worship and statements of the creed and so on. Yet he still also worshipped in the courthouse. And he talked wonderfully about how the different denominations share the courthouse as the common temple. And he also then even gives money in his account book to the Episcopalian Church, Presbyterian Church, and Baptist Church. when they all start building their own churches. So we have a quite active churchman, a leader, very active in the Episcopal Church, yet at the same time, the very last year of his life, 1825, for the first time, he clearly calls himself a Unitarian in 1825. So he's both calling himself now a Unitarian and an Episcopal member church of the Episcopal Church. So I think we have from this, in conclusion, a lot more interesting evidence that should make us reevaluate him. The summary of the distorted views, I would say, of Jefferson, I think there's much more evidence out there that we can look at and begin to realize there's a whole lot more nuance to this man when it comes to religion. He's not a clear, simple statement that we can categorize him. In fact, Jefferson said to one person, Mrs. Smith, he says, "The priests indeed have heretofore thought proper to ascribe to me religious or rather anti-religious sentiments of their own fabric. They wished him to be thought atheist, deist, or devil." And I think in some ways, a lot of people still almost have this view. They try to fit him into that category or something still to this day. But I think he defies such categories, and we should be, I think, looking more again in my books. Again, I encourage you to study more. I've only given a few examples of the many, over 100 new letters never before seen on religion until I've just published them now. And there's so much more evidence we can study that I think will be worth the pursuit. So thank you very much for allowing me to share these thoughts with you.